Hello and welcome. Please come in. We have another summary video to do. Another challenge is done, another run complete, and it's time to talk about how our little black mage's journeys went. If you haven't seen the playthroughs, there is a card in the corner for a playlist of all the black mage only runs. The experience will hopefully be elucidating. And boy, were these longer than our prior learning opportunities. But that's okay. That just means we have more material to go over. Enough of the preamble. Let's get into the runs. So, we begin with a question I mentioned briefly in my Daggers Only Souls series. And that is that one of the biggest changes in a run, from one game in a series to the next, is what are you giving up within the context of that game? I didn't really talk too much about it in the Souls games, mostly because giving things up is core to the design of Souls games. Or, for Souls, it may be more accurate to say making choices. You simply can't use the best miracles and the best sorceries and the biggest weapons and the best armor. The trade-off is part of the core design. That's not true in Final Fantasy. In most games, the whole point is for your entire party to be able to work together to overcome any challenge. It's not a game of skill, it's a game of planning and strategy, and maybe a little skill. So, the first question we need to get into is what do you give up when you decide to only have black mages, and what does that mean in the context of these games? Now, this won't be a tier list, not for this section anyway, but we do need to go through each game in order to really dig into this idea, as it will heavily inform the rest of the summary. And we start in Final Fantasy I, where the question of black mages only is at its most simple. At the start of the game, you choose your party of 4 characters from 6 different classes. You do get upgraded classes later, but I viewed that more as an upgrade rather than a distinct class change, so it doesn't count. Which means what you give up for black mages only is you can only use black mages, which sounds very obvious, but it is important to establish the baseline for the remainder of the games. Every character gets one class, and you can't change your class. So each class is designed to be useful throughout the entire game, and the encounters are designed around this idea. So while certain spells or attacks may be more useful in certain areas or dungeons, they are never intended to make a character feel useless. Black mages have offensive spells, but they also have statuses and buff spells, and like 6 different ways to cause instant death for some reason. So even when they are not the best damage dealers, they have some limited support and utility. And being only black mages means weak equipment, no healing, and no durability. So FF1 is a simple explanation, but it does serve as a great baseline as we compare it to the remaining games in our challenge series. And speaking of, it's time to talk about Final Fantasy V, which has a job class system that functions very differently. Rather than a one-off decision of what class to choose, all characters start as freelancers, and you gradually unlock a wide number of jobs throughout the first half of the game. This completely changes the dynamic between jobs and the game's encounter design. In Final Fantasy I, the classes had to be evergreen, always useful in any random encounter, at least to some degree, because if they weren't, that character was useless. That is no longer true. Now you can change jobs basically whenever you want. Which means the encounter designers can design their fights, both regular and boss, to be different, precise, or require interesting strategies. And it shows, particularly in the fights that I had a lot of trouble with. The Archaeoavis is basically immune to black mages in its final phase. Necrophobe is basically immune to black magic unless I equip the Reflect Ring, reflect death off that character, and hope it targets and hits the right enemy? Even easier encounters like the Liquid Flame pose difficulties. I had to unequip my weapon and punch it to get it to change forms. This highlights a huge departure in encounter design. This game doesn't need to work with every class. Black magic not useful here? Swap it for a monk. Need some extra oomph? Make a character a berserker or a knight. This change in design sensibilities means you not only lose the character variety in having your party of 4 have different and presumably complementary classes, it also robs you of the versatility of changing your class at basically any time. There were fights that ended up being easy because the answer to the puzzle the game had presented was spam Firaga. And then other fights were unexpected walls. And then we get to the other half of the piece, secondary abilities. It didn't come up in Black Mages only, but every class, as it levels, teaches new abilities. For the mages, this isn't super meaningful because it just unlocks higher tiered levels of magic, which isn't an issue when you are that class. But other classes teach very useful abilities, and by being limited to Black Mages only meant I couldn't take advantage of them. Brawler to give me an unarmed attack that deals good damage, equip armor to increase all my mages' durabilities, white magic or time magic to expand my spell access, all nope. Which meant I was basically limited to MP plus 30%, the only meaningful secondary ability Black Mages learn, except they don't get it until they master the class. So I didn't have this until almost the end of the game, by which time I had a stockpile of MP restoring items. So not only was I limited to one single job, when a casual playthrough could swap it around at any time, but I was also limited to one job, when most characters would really be 1.5 or 2 jobs at once thanks to the power of secondary abilities. And this isn't just a variety disparity, it's a power disparity. And that brings us to Final Fantasy XII, which takes a very interesting approach to the class design. Probably at least in part because it was stapled over the existing license board system. So it works differently? Almost like a hybrid of Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy V. So you don't start with an existing class. Instead, the first time you access the license grid with each character, you select from one of 12 classes. These determine what spells, abilities, and equipment your character has access to, and these decisions stick throughout the game. Kind of. There is a mechanic that was patched in later to let you change out your job selection, but it was patched in, and I feel the intended mechanic is still choose, and then you are stuck with that. So, much like Final Fantasy I, the game is designed around the single class per character design, except that's not quite right. Because unlike the prior two games, you actually have 6 characters, and you can have any 3 characters out at once. So while you can't change your jobs, you can swap characters around as you need. This adds back in a lot of the versatility you lose by being stuck in one class. And then there are the default abilities that the characters start with. These vary from character to character, and can be very important in that they add a bit of flavor, and potentially give them access to skills their job wouldn't otherwise give them. We saw how effective Cure was throughout the run with Penelo and Ash. These distinctions are small, but they are not insignificant. And even beyond that, stats can change the efficacy of a character. I nearly chose Bosch for his innate Libra ability, even though his magic stat is awful, but ended up not. These stat differences can change a lot. And actually I lied, you aren't stuck with one class. While this was true in the original international release, in the Zodiac Age remaster they expanded this. Once you defeat Belias, the first Esper, each character can access a second license board, drastically expanding each character's options. Identical licenses are shared, but anything else is available to the character. Want a black mage with all the white magic in the world? You can do that. Want your knight to have a wide variety of magic? Red mage can be your second class. Want to waste that second class on garbage? Machinist was made for you. The ability to give each character 2 classes and sub the characters in and out at will changes everything. You can have all 12 classes in your party or double up on actually useful ones, which was never an option in prior games. Being stuck with only black mages changes this variety dynamic and flattens your party. Why level up all 6 characters when they are basically the same character but with slightly different stats? You lose a lot this way. Okay, that was a lot of time taken up to discuss the difference in meaning between different Black Mage only runs, which was very useful, as I think it really hammered home how a single challenge can change so much from game to game. But now it's back to tier list time as we discuss the more direct axes of comparison. And we start with difficulty. And difficulty is a bit weird in a turn-based or pseudo-turn-based RPG, because unlike a Souls game, execution isn't really important. But I shall endeavor to treat these titles as fairly as I can in this comparison, and the first comparison point is difficulty, because I think this still applies. It's a judgment on execution and problem solving. And we start at the beginning, as we always do, with Final Fantasy I. And this game is really interesting, because it's not actually a very difficult game in general, it's just poorly balanced in the ratio of XP to gold to cost of things. So it can seem difficult, but it's actually just grindy, which can be a thin line to walk. I mean, in any game with leveling you can, effectively, out-level the challenge. But at least in Final Fantasy I, the line between these two is pretty clear, at least to me. I enabled all the boosts to increase gold and XP game, but never felt over-leveled. The challenge actually felt pretty close to intended, and I was still pretty limited in purchasing items. Seriously, enemies should drop at least 3 times as much gold as they do, otherwise you'll end up over-leveled just trying to afford current equipment and spells. So where does that leave difficulty? Last place. Yeah, FF1 is not actually a difficult game, mostly, and functionally needing to grind enemies to afford basic healing items just means you may end up over-leveled just trying to buy things. And that basically persists until the end of the game. I mean, I can only remember 2 fights that were actually difficult. Merilith, who was resistant to magic, and Chaos, which we'll get to. Most other fights were pretty much cast spells until dead, and they died pretty quickly, despite magic generally dealing less damage than physical attacks would have in this game. It did make me use status effects for the first time, which was interesting, but I wouldn't say challenging. Maybe it's just that black mages are OP? I mean, no. I actually think they are trash after this run, but even then I felt unchallenged. And then Chaos was balanced terribly. I got into it in the video, so I don't feel like the need to relive the trauma here. Suffice it to say, bad game design doesn't get to elevate you from Edius. Sorry. Nice try, Final Fantasy I. And then we have Final Fantasy V. This game was a really interesting run, and I think it's going to get the top spot on difficulty. Final Fantasy games aren't difficult, even in a challenge run like this, so the true mark of difficulty is how much strategy I have to involve / problems to solve to get past its challenges. And Final Fantasy V had that in spades. Spades? Oh, shovelfuls, I get it now. And there was not a small number of difficulties. Inability to do anything other than magic damage was a big hindrance in the game, and enemies counterattacking proved to cause problems throughout the run. And the way healing access is placed out, as in very badly, made only black mages feel very limited. But this game also has a huge versatility and options available to you. The elemental rods dealt great damage from beginning to end. There were actually daggers to use. Healing items, once I could get better ones. The elemental rings that let me massively heal my party with fire. All of this meant I had ways to fill in the gaps, or at least pave over them. And this didn't negate the challenge either. It just meant every fresh boss fight was a new question of, okay, how do I solve this? Which made it not only the most difficult game, but also the most interesting. And if any of the pieces to my strategy hadn't been in the game, I don't know that I would have been able to do about it. So, Final Fantasy V gets the top spot in difficulty. Which, of course, leaves Final Fantasy XII with the middle difficulty. Don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy XII is great, and the license boards are a very versatile progression path that makes the jobs simultaneously very distinct from one another, and also able to carry a whole character. And there was difficulty. Except I can't shake the feeling that most of the difficulty in this game was only difficult because Reflect existed. Every boss, other than Vayne himself, was only really an issue when they abused Reflect, or the plant that ate my MP and gave me a disease. But every other boss, and every boss after getting the Opal Ring, was really no longer difficult. Bypassing Reflect meant there was nothing to stop my damage output, and in the video I asked where on the damage spectrum FF12 would fall, and it didn't. It actually extended the spectrum further past FF5. And all that was really without engaging with the optional content. Getting the best armor, the best staves, the best accessories even. The game was challenging in many ways, but like Elden Ring before it, just has too much variety in skills and abilities to really hold its own in this difficulty. It still gets to be higher than FF1, but only because its difficulty was interesting difficulty instead of stupid difficulty. And then we arrive at the real reason it can't be given top spot, espers. I only used these in the final fight, and I'm glad I did. The power and versatility these introduced to the game are, quite frankly, unreasonable. When my thought after using espers was, maybe there's a solo character run in my future, that's not a great sign for difficulty. The final boss series of fights in this game could be very difficult, but not for Hushmal though. So it only gets the middle position. Though, hey, new idea for a challenge run series at least. And with difficulty out of the way, we arrive at our final section, the coveted recommended section. Would I recommend these challenge runs to others? This is always my favorite section of the video. It just has so much to think about. So many avenues of comparison. Difficulty plays a role, but so do so many other aspects of the game. And I just love the idea of a complex comparison between different games to see which you should play. And we start with FF1. Would I recommend a Black Mages only run of Final Fantasy I? No, not really. Next! I kid. I mean, the answer is actually no, but I am going to talk about it because there's actually a lot to discuss. Beyond just the challenge run, would I recommend Final Fantasy I is kind of a no. It may have been a groundbreaking start to a game series I adore, but taken on its own merits, the game is kind of a mess. And that's even taking into account the fact that I'm playing the Pixel Remaster version rather than the original. It's just, there is not much to recommend. First is progression. It's grindy, and there is no secondary axis of progression to keep it interesting. No job levels, no license points, whatever, which really bogs down the moment-by-moment feel. And the Pixel Remaster version has boosts, but if you aren't very mindful, you might overlevel. And then the Black Mages only question just compounds this. Having to afford all the spells for all the characters slows down money even more than normal. And while Black Mages do have support spells, they are exceedingly limited. Basically just improving physical damage, which, to be honest, is the way the game really wants you to play. Even before getting the Masamune, I could feel the game chafing against the idea of using magic for offense. You can feel it in the damage you do against bosses. I used to really hate the idea that Black Mages weren't a good class in this game, but after beating the entire game with only Black Mages, I kind of have to agree. I've tried to think of a way to modify the challenge to make it do better in this ranking, and honestly, it just doesn't. I recommend this challenge least of all, and that's because it's not the best game, and Black Mages only just compounds my issues with it. Next, we look at Final Fantasy V, and after FF1, this is a breath of fresh air. It's not perfect, looking at you, healing item access, but it definitely improves on Final Fantasy I in basically every way. I'm only using 3 different tiers, but I did consider having more tiers, just so I could put more space between Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy V. Even with all the nonsense, this game earns the middle spot. Black Mages have their weaknesses: low durability, poor equipment access, one-dimensional playstyle, but boy howdy, when you need damage done, they deal damage. Except in bosses that specifically reject you using magic against them, Black Mages do not mess around. They start off a bit better at dealing damage than other characters, and then just don't stop getting stronger. And the lack of status healing is a problem, but when the answer is murder harder, murder faster, I can get behind that. Final Fantasy V also has just enough side stuff, breakable equipment, usable items, to add a bit of versatility where Black Mages desperately lack it. There were several other random items I didn't want to deal with that would have made things even more interesting. But yeah, Final Fantasy V earns a hearty recommend from me. Not the most recommend, mind you, but it's a good game with a very good class, and the areas it struggles feels correct when doing a Black Mages Only challenge. And finally, it's FF12, which earns the top spot. It was always going to, and not just because FF12 is criminally underrated and more people should play it. I mean, it is, and they should, but it's also just a fun challenge. Black Mages Only presents really interesting problems in the pseudo-real-time framework of Final Fantasy XII's combat system. AoE spells are great, and their damage is amazing, but Reflect exists, and your physical attacks are very limited. You have healing items, paced at reasonable intervals in progression, but those aren't the same as Curaja. So the question of the day becomes how fast can you burn down a boss? And will it be fast enough? And if not, what can you do to change that formula? FF12 also has a lot of optional endgame content that I didn't engage with. New weapons and armor to make you stronger, new espers unlocking licenses on a character's grid. There is a lot you can do to make this challenge a fun, problem-solving experience. So yes, Final Fantasy XII earns the top spot on this list. It is easily my favorite of these games, and I think has the best balance of challenge and solution. Maybe don't use espers though, because turns out they can trivialize boss fights. Up to you, though. Make your own choices. Well, wasn't that fun? Going through the games, doing our little comparison. Black Mages Only are done now. We needn't think on them again. Just another in a long series of lessons to learn. If this is your first time, do consider coming back. Drop a like, maybe subscribe. Our next series will be starting next Friday, and it will be majestic. But either way, have a lovely trip home.